The letter arrived on a gray morning, and it changed everything before Julian Ashworth had even finished his tea. He stood in the study of Thirlwood Hall, the seal of the family solicitor broken in his hand, and read the words twice, because the first reading refused to make sense. His uncle, the old Duke, had been dead only 3 weeks. Julian had expected grief, paperwork, perhaps a few awkward conversations with tenants who did not yet trust him. He had not expected this. The will contained a condition. If the new Duke of Thirlwood did not marry and produce a legitimate heir within 12 months of his uncle's death, the entire estate, the title, the land, the townhouse in the city, all of it would pass instead to a cousin named Edmund Grail, a man Julian had met perhaps 4 times in his life, and disliked on each occasion. Julian set the letter down on the desk and stared at it, as though it might rearrange itself into something less absurd. It did not. 12 months, he said aloud, to no one, because the room was empty and the words needed to be spoken by someone. He was 31 years old, a man who had spent the better part of the last decade avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement. He had watched friends stumble into marriages built on infatuation, watched those marriages curdle within a year or two, once the infatuation faded, and the 2 people underneath it turned out to be strangers. He had promised himself, quietly and firmly, that when he did marry, it would be for reasons that made sense in the cold light of morning, not reasons that only made sense by candlelight. Now the choice had been taken from him. There would be no slow courtship, no season of careful observation, no luxury of time. There was a clock now, ticking somewhere behind his ribs, and every day that passed brought Edmund Grail one day closer to inheriting a house and a name he had done nothing to earn. He rang for his solicitor again that afternoon, a careful man named Mr. Whitfield who had served the family for 2 decades and had the particular talent of delivering bad news without changing his expression. "Is there no way around it?" Julian asked, though he already suspected the answer. "I have looked at the wording 3 times, Your Grace," Whitfield said. "Your uncle was thorough. He wished for the line to continue, and he did not trust you to see to it in his own time. Forgive me for saying so plainly. You may say it however you like. It does not change the 12 months. No," Whitfield agreed, "it does not." Julian walked to the window and looked out over the grounds, the long avenue of elms his grandfather had planted, the lake that caught the last gray light of the afternoon. All of it, generations of careful stewardship, hung now on whether he could find a wife and produce a child within a single turn of the calendar. He thought, briefly and with some bitterness, of the young women he had met in ballrooms over the years. Beautiful, most of them, some clever, a few kind, but nearly all of them had looked at him the way one looks at a prize to be won, their eyes flicking to his title, before they ever truly saw his face. He had no patience left for that kind of courtship, and even less time for it now. That evening, his sister Charlotte came to dine with him, as she often did since their parents had passed, and it was only the 2 of them left in the immediate family. Charlotte was younger by 4 years, married to a baronet of modest means, and possessed of an honesty that Julian had always found either useful or exhausting depending on the day. "You look as though someone has died," she said, settling into her chair. "Someone did die, 3 weeks ago. You looked less troubled at the funeral than you do now. What is it?" He told her. He watched her face move through surprise, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like amusement, which annoyed him more than either of the other reactions. 12 months, she repeated, echoing his own earlier words. "Well, you had better start attending balls, brother, and quickly." "I have no intention of attending balls." "Then how exactly do you intend to marry?" Julian set down his fork. He had been turning the problem over in his mind since the letter arrived, and somewhere in the turning, a shape had begun to form, rough and unromantic, but solid. "I do not need a great love," he said. "I need a wife, a sensible one, a woman who understands what is being asked of her, and agrees to it with her eyes open, not one who imagines herself swept into a fairy tale, only to be disappointed within the year, when she discovers I am not a hero from a novel." Charlotte studied him for a long moment. "You want a plain, practical woman, no romance, no fuss." "Precisely. That is either the most sensible plan I have ever heard from you, or the saddest." "It may be both," Julian admitted. "But I do not have the luxury of choosing only one." Charlotte was quiet for a while, turning her wineglass slowly by its stem. Julian could see her mind working, the way it always did when she was deciding whether to argue with him or help him. He hoped, for once, it would be the latter. "If this is truly what you want," she said finally, "then I will help you find her. But I want it understood, Julian, that I think you are making a mistake in how you are approaching this. A marriage built only on practicality can still surprise you. People are not ledgers. They do not always stay in the columns you assign them. I am not asking for your opinion on the philosophy of marriage, Charlotte. I am asking for your help finding a woman who will not object to a business arrangement." "You are asking for both, whether you know it or not," she said, but she was already thinking, already running through the families of her acquaintance, the daughters of clergymen and modest gentry who might fit what her brother described, women overlooked by the ballroom crowds, precisely because they lacked the shine that Julian now claimed not to want. Over the following days, the household at Thirlwood Hall settled into a strange, quiet urgency. Servants noticed it first, the way the new Duke moved through his days with a distracted energy, signing papers without his usual care, staring too long out of windows. The tenants noticed it too, in the way he rode the fields with less patience than before, his mind clearly elsewhere even as his body went through the motions of his new responsibilities. Julian tried, in those first days, to imagine the season ahead of him differently. He pictured himself at a ball, moving from one young woman to the next, asking careful questions designed to reveal character rather than charm. He pictured the whispers that would follow him, the assumptions people would make about a duke suddenly eager to marry. He pictured, worst of all, the kind of woman who might see through his practical intentions and use them against him, accepting his offer, not out of honesty, but out of ambition, dressed up as sense. He did not want that. He wanted someone who would tell him the truth, even when it was inconvenient. Someone who would not fall to pieces when she learned the marriage was born of necessity, rather than affection, because she would understand necessity herself. Someone plain enough, in both appearance and manner, that she had likely spent her life overlooked by men who wanted only beauty, and sensible enough that she would recognize an honest offer when she saw one. It was, he knew, an unusual thing to want. Most men in his position would have sought the opposite, a beautiful bride to display alongside the title, a woman whose looks would soften the coldness of the arrangement in the eyes of society. But Julian had never cared much for society's eyes, and he suspected that a woman chosen for beauty alone would resent him within a year for choosing her as one chooses furniture, while a woman chosen for her good sense might come to respect him instead, might even, in time, become something like a partner rather than a decoration. He did not let himself imagine further than that. There was no room, in the plan he was building, for anything softer than respect. Love was a luxury for men who were not standing at the edge of a 12-month cliff. On the 5th day after the letter arrived, Charlotte returned to Thirlwood Hall with a list. She presented it to him over breakfast. 3 names, written in her neat hand, each accompanied by a small note about family, temperament, and circumstance. "These are women I believe you should meet," she said. "Not because they are the most beautiful in the county, because they are the most sensible. I have chosen carefully, Julian. Do not waste my effort by dismissing them without meeting them properly." Julian read the list twice. 2 of the names meant nothing to him. The third, Eleanor Hartley, he recognized vaguely as the daughter of a vicar in a neighboring parish, a family of modest means and quiet reputation. "Tell me about the vicar's daughter," he said. "Miss Hartley," Charlotte said, "is 26 years old, which by the standards of the ton makes her nearly invisible, since most men consider a woman past her prime the moment she turns 22. She has never had a season in the city, because her family could not afford one. She manages her father's household with what I am told is remarkable efficiency, keeps the parish accounts better than the church warden himself, and has a reputation among the local families for being blunt to the point of rudeness, though those who know her well say it is honesty rather than rudeness. She is not considered a beauty. She is considered sensible, which in your case, brother, may be the higher compliment." Julian felt something settle in his chest as he listened, a small certainty forming where before there had only been dread. He did not know yet whether Eleanor Hartley would agree to what he needed, or whether she would want any part of a marriage built on necessity rather than feeling. But something in the description, the bluntness, the competence, the years of being overlooked by men who wanted only prettiness, told him she was worth meeting before anyone else on the list. Arrange it, he said, as soon as it can be done without drawing too much attention. Charlotte smiled, a small, knowing smile that Julian did not entirely trust. You say that, as though the county will not notice the Duke of Thirlwood suddenly calling on Vicar's daughters. They will notice, Julian. They notice everything. But I will do what I can to make it look like an accident of circumstance rather than a plan. Thank you. Do not thank me yet, she said, rising from the table. You have not even met her. And I warn you now, brother, if you go into that meeting, treating her like an item on a shopping list, she will see through you in a moment, and she will not thank you for it. Whatever you think this arrangement is, remember that she is a person, not a solution to your uncle's cruelty. Julian did not answer, but he turned the words over in his mind long after Charlotte had gone. He told himself he understood what she meant. He told himself he had no intention of treating Eleanor Hartley, or any woman, as a mere solution. And yet, as he sat alone in the study that evening, with the solicitor's letter still resting on the corner of his desk, he could not deny that the shape of his plan was, at its heart, exactly the kind of thing his sister had warned him against. A ledger with a name written at the top of it, waiting to be filled in. He decided, before he went to bed that night, that he would try to do better than that. Whatever came of the meeting with Miss Hartley, he would at least give her the respect of honesty, laid out plainly, with no pretense dressed up as romance, and no romance dressed up as pretense. If she refused him, he would understand. If she accepted, he wanted it to be with her eyes fully open, the way he intended to keep his own. Outside his window, the elm trees moved in the evening wind, and somewhere beyond the dark fields, in a small parish house he had never visited, a woman he had not yet met was finishing her evening prayers, entirely unaware that a duke's future, and quite possibly her own, had just been quietly set in motion. The 12 months had already begun to shrink. Julian counted them again, before he slept, the way a man counts coins he is afraid he does not have enough of, and resolved that tomorrow, or as soon as Charlotte could arrange it, he would meet the woman who might change the shape of his life, without either of them wanting anything so foolish as love. He did not know, as he closed his eyes that night, how wrong he would turn out to be about that last part. He only knew that morning would bring him one step closer to a meeting he could not afford to get wrong, and that the weight of the entailment sat on his chest, like a stone that would not move until a child, someday, finally lifted it away. Charlotte arranged the meeting for the following Thursday, under the pretense of a small gathering at her own home, a modest afternoon tea, meant to look like nothing more than neighborly kindness. She invited the vicar and his daughter along with 2 other families from the parish, so that no single guest would appear singled out, and she instructed her brother, quite firmly, to arrive fashionably late so that his presence would seem incidental rather than arranged. Julian found the whole exercise faintly ridiculous. He was a grown man of 31 years, a duke with an estate to run and a deadline pressing against his back, and here he was, being told to time his arrival at his own sister's tea, so as not to alarm a vicar's daughter he had never met. And yet he did as he was told, because Charlotte understood the delicate machinery of village gossip far better than he did, and because some part of him, buried beneath the urgency, wanted this particular meeting to go well enough that he would not need to repeat the exercise with either of the other 2 names on the list. When he arrived, the small drawing room was already full of quiet conversation and the clink of teacups. Charlotte caught his eye across the room and gave the faintest nod toward a window seat, where a young woman sat slightly apart from the others, a book closed in her lap, as though she had been reading before the room grew too crowded for concentration. She wore a dress of plain gray wool, well made but entirely without ornament, and her dark hair was pulled back with none of the careful arrangement that fashionable women spent hours achieving. She was not beautiful in the way the ton measured beauty, not delicate or striking, but there was something steady in the set of her shoulders, something that suggested a woman comfortable in her own skin, regardless of who was watching. Julian crossed the room, and Charlotte, with the practiced ease of a hostess, made the introduction sound entirely natural. Miss Hartley, may I present my brother, the Duke of Thirlwood. Julian, this is Miss Eleanor Hartley, our vicar's daughter. Eleanor rose and offered a curtsy that was correct without being elaborate, and when she straightened, she looked at him directly, without the fluttering shyness he had grown used to from young women meeting a duke for the first time. Your Grace, she said, I understand congratulations are in order, though I imagine you have heard little else these past weeks besides congratulations for a title that arrived alongside a funeral. It seems a strange thing to celebrate." Julian blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of it, and found himself, quite unexpectedly, smiling. "You are the first person to say so plainly," he said. "Most simply offer congratulations, and expect me to be delighted. I find delight is rarely the correct response to inheriting responsibility through grief," Eleanor said. "But perhaps I speak too freely. My father tells me it is a fault I have never managed to correct." "I would not call it a fault," Julian said. "I have had a great deal of careful politeness directed at me these past weeks. I find I prefer plain speech." They spoke for a while longer, standing near the window while the rest of the room carried on its own conversations, oblivious to the quiet weight of the exchange taking place beside the glass. Julian asked her about the parish, about her father's work, and found her answers direct and unadorned, free of the performance he had come to expect from young women trying to impress him. She spoke of managing the household accounts with the same matter-of-fact tone another woman might have used to discuss the weather, and when he asked whether she found the work tedious, she looked at him as though the question itself was slightly foolish. "Tedious implies there is a choice in the matter," she said. "The accounts must be kept, whether I find them interesting or not. I have found that most necessary things become bearable once you stop asking whether you enjoy them, and simply attend to doing them well." Julian thought of the entailment, of the 12 months ticking away behind his ribs, and felt an odd kinship with the sentiment. He had spent the past several days wishing his own necessary thing away, wishing there were some clever escape from his uncle's demand, and here was a woman telling him, without any idea of his private trouble, that necessity was simply something to be attended to well rather than resented. "That is a rather practical philosophy," he said. "I am told I am a rather practical person," Eleanor replied, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest she was not entirely serious in her self-assessment. Charlotte watched the exchange from across the room with poorly disguised interest, and when the tea eventually drew to its natural close and guests began to take their leave, she caught her brother's arm before he could depart. "Well?" she asked, quietly enough that no one else could hear. "She is exactly as you described," Julian said, sensible, direct, entirely unimpressed by my title. "And is that a point in her favor or against her?" "In her favor," Julian said, with more certainty than he expected to feel. "Very much in her favor." Over the following 2 weeks, Julian found reasons to call on the vicarage, small excuses that grew progressively less convincing, even to his own ears. A question about a piece of land bordering the church property, a donation to the parish poor fund that could easily have been sent by messenger, but which he delivered himself. Each visit lasted longer than the one before, and each time, he found himself more struck by the same quality that had drawn him to her at Charlotte's tea, a mind that did not perform for him, a manner that did not soften or sharpen depending on what she thought he wanted to hear. The vicar, a gentle and somewhat absent-minded man named Reverend Hartley, seemed entirely unaware of the significance of these visits, greeting the Duke each time with the same mild pleasure he might have shown a passing acquaintance. It was Eleanor who eventually addressed the matter directly, on an afternoon when Julian had called under the thinnest pretense yet, something about the condition of a fence that bordered church land, a matter that could easily have waited until the following season. She met him in the small garden behind the vicarage, where she had been cutting herbs for the kitchen, and set down her basket when she saw him approaching. "Your Grace," she said, "I confess I am beginning to wonder about the true purpose of these visits. Fences and land boundaries do not usually require a duke's personal attention, delivered so frequently." Julian considered lying, considered offering some further small excuse to extend the pretense a while longer. But he thought of what he had told himself that first night after the letter arrived, that whatever came of this, he owed the woman honesty rather than performance. "You are correct," he said. "The fence is not the reason for my visits. I have come, Miss Hartley, because I find myself in need of a wife, under circumstances that leave me very little time to find one in the ordinary way, and I have come to believe, over these past 2 weeks, that you may be exactly the sort of woman I need." Eleanor did not gasp, did not press a hand to her chest in the manner of novels, did not turn away in maidenly confusion. She simply looked at him, her expression carefully neutral, and said, "That is a rather unusual declaration, Your Grace. Most men, I am told, prefer to speak of affection before they speak of need. I have no wish to insult you with false affection, Julian said. I barely know you. What I can offer you is honesty, and an arrangement that would benefit us both, if you are willing to hear the details before you judge them. Then you had better tell me the details, Eleanor said, folding her hands in front of her, her gaze steady and unflinching. I find I am rarely persuaded by anything less than the whole truth, Your Grace, and I have little patience for men who dress up their needs as romance in order to make them more palatable. Julian explained the entailment then, standing in the small garden with the scent of crushed herbs still hanging in the air between them. The 12-month deadline, the cousin waiting eagerly in the wings, the marriage and the heir his uncle's will demanded of him, before the year was through. He watched her face as he spoke, looking for some sign of alarm or offense, but she listened with the same steady attention she seemed to bring to everything, occasionally nodding, once asking a sharp clarifying question about the exact wording of the will. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking past him toward the low stone wall that marked the edge of the garden. You are telling me, she said finally, that you wish to marry me, not out of any particular regard for my character, but because I am sensible, unlikely to be swept up in romantic notions, and willing to accept an arrangement built on practicality, rather than feeling. Is that a fair summary, Your Grace? It is, Julian admitted, though I would add that I have come to have a genuine regard for your character, in these past 2 weeks. That much at least is not calculation. Eleanor considered this, her expression difficult to read. And what would this arrangement offer me, precisely, beyond the honor of a title I did not seek? Security, Julian said, for yourself, and for your family. Your father's living is modest, and I understand your brothers have not yet found their footing in the world. As Duchess of Thirlwood, you would want for nothing, and neither would they. In exchange, I would ask only that you enter this marriage honestly, understanding what it is and what it is not, and that you make a genuine effort, alongside me, to fulfill the terms my uncle's will demands. An heir within the year, Eleanor said plainly, without any trace of embarrassment, and Julian found himself, once again, quietly impressed by her refusal to dance around uncomfortable truths. Yes. She was quiet again, longer this time, and Julian made himself wait, resisting the urge to fill the silence with further persuasion. He had learned enough of her already to suspect that pressing her would only harden her resistance, if resistance was what she felt. I will need time to consider this properly, she said at last, and I will need to speak with my father, though I suspect his approval will not be difficult to obtain given our circumstances. But I want you to understand something, Your Grace, before I give you any answer at all. Tell me. I am not offended by your honesty, Eleanor said. I find it, in fact, rather more respectable than the alternative. I have watched enough young women in this parish dream of dashing proposals, only to marry men who turned out to be strangers, wearing the mask of a suitor. If I agree to this, I would rather know exactly what I am agreeing to, plainly stated, than be handed a pretty lie I would have to unravel later. But I will not be treated as a mere solution to your problem, once the arrangement is made. If we are to build a household together, even one built on necessity rather than affection, I expect to be regarded as a partner in it, not a convenience. You have my word, Julian said, and found that he meant it more deeply than he had expected to, standing there in the small garden, with the afternoon light slanting low across the stone wall. Eleanor nodded once, a small, decisive movement, and picked up her basket of herbs from where she had set it down. Then give me a few days, Your Grace, she said, and I will give you my answer. She turned and walked back toward the house, and Julian stood alone in the garden for a moment longer, watching her go, aware of a strange lightness in his chest that had not been there when he arrived. He told himself it was relief, the simple relief of a plan finally taking shape after weeks of dread. He did not yet let himself consider that it might be something else entirely, something that had no place in a ledger of practical arrangements, quietly beginning to take root. Eleanor did not sleep well that night, though she would not have admitted it to anyone who asked. She lay awake in her small room at the vicarage, staring at the ceiling, turning the Duke's proposal over in her mind, the way she might have examined a column of figures that refused to balance no matter how many times she added them. She had always believed herself immune to the kind of foolish daydreaming that afflicted other young women in the parish, the ones who sighed over handsome strangers, and imagined themselves swept away into lives of ease and romance. She had watched her closest friend, a girl named Margaret Ellis, spend an entire season convinced that a visiting curate was destined to marry her, only to discover he had been quietly courting a wealthier woman in the next parish the entire time. Eleanor had comforted her friend through the resulting heartbreak and had privately resolved never to allow herself the same vulnerability. She had told herself, more than once, that if marriage ever came to her, it would come through reason rather than romance, and she had believed, until this week, that no man would ever offer her the chance to test that resolve. Now a duke had walked into her garden and offered her exactly that, laid out with a bluntness that matched her own, and she found herself unable to dismiss it as easily as she had once imagined she would. She rose before dawn, as was her habit, and went about her morning tasks with the same steady attention she brought to everything, though her mind kept circling back to the conversation in the garden. By the time her father came down for breakfast, she had decided that the matter deserved to be spoken of directly, in the same plain manner the Duke himself had used. "Father," she said, setting a plate before him, "I have received an offer of marriage." Reverend Hartley looked up from his tea with mild surprise, the expression of a man accustomed to the small, predictable rhythms of parish life being gently disturbed. "An offer? From whom, my dear?" "From the Duke of Thirlwood." Her father set down his cup rather more firmly than he intended, and a little tea splashed onto the tablecloth. "The Duke," he repeated. "Our Duke. The young man who has been asking after fences." "There was never truly anything wrong with the fences, father." "I suspected as much," Reverend Hartley said, though not unkindly. "I confess I assumed his visits were simply the habit of a new landowner, familiarizing himself with his responsibilities. I did not imagine he had marriage in mind." Eleanor explained the situation as plainly as she could, the entailment, the deadline, the practical nature of the arrangement the Duke had proposed, watching her father's face carefully for signs of alarm or disapproval. Instead, she found something closer to thoughtful consideration, the same expression he wore when weighing a difficult passage of scripture for his weekly sermon. "He was honest with you," her father said finally. "That much speaks well of him. I have known men of far lower rank who could not manage such plain dealing with a woman they meant to marry." "I thought the same," Eleanor admitted. "But father, I do not wish to enter such an arrangement lightly, nor do I wish you to feel that our family's circumstances are pressing me toward a decision I would not otherwise make." Reverend Hartley reached across the table and took his daughter's hand, an unusual gesture for a man not given to displays of affection. "Eleanor, I would never wish for you to marry out of obligation to me, or to your brothers. But I have watched you these past years, managing this household, keeping our small accounts in better order than many wealthier families manage theirs, and I have often wondered what life might offer a woman of your sense and capability, in a parish that offers so little scope for either. If this Duke has truly seen those qualities in you, and values them honestly rather than merely tolerating them, then I do not think you should dismiss the offer simply because it lacks the poetry young women are taught to expect. And if I come to regret a marriage built on such practical terms, then you will have entered it with your eyes open, which is more than can be said for most marriages built on infatuation alone," her father said. "I have buried enough parishioners and comforted enough disappointed brides to know that romance promised at the altar is no guarantee of a happy household. Sense and honesty, freely given on both sides, have a better record than most people credit them with." Eleanor sat with her father's words for the rest of the day, carrying them with her as she went about her usual tasks, and by the time evening came, she found that her own mind had begun to settle, not into certainty exactly, but into something steadier than the confusion of the previous night. She thought of the Duke as she had observed him over these past weeks, the careful attention he paid when she spoke, the way he had listened without interrupting, even when her opinions ran contrary to what a lesser man might have wanted to hear. She thought of his honesty in the garden, the way he had laid out his need without dressing it in false sentiment, and the way he had promised to treat her as a partner rather than a convenience. She thought too of the alternative, a life spent in the parish, useful but small, her considerable capabilities forever confined to a household accounts book and a church poor fund, never tested against anything larger. It was not romance that decided her in the end. It was something closer to respect, both for the honesty he had offered, and for the possibility, however uncertain, of a life that might ask more of her than the quiet rhythms of the vicarage ever could. 3 days after the conversation in the garden, Eleanor sent word to Thirlwood Hall, requesting that the Duke call on her again. Julian arrived within the hour, having clearly been waiting for exactly such a message, and Eleanor received him once more in the garden, where the herbs she had been cutting on the day of his proposal had since been dried and hung in neat bundles in the vicarage kitchen. "You have your answer," she said, without preamble, in the same direct manner that had struck him from their very first conversation. "I do. I will marry you, Your Grace, on the terms you described. I ask only that the arrangement be conducted with the honesty you promised, and that my family's security be settled formally, in writing, before any ceremony takes place. I do not say this because I doubt your word, but because I have learned that even honest men sometimes find their circumstances change, and I would rather my father and brothers not be left dependent on goodwill alone." Julian felt something in his chest loosen, a tension he had been carrying since the solicitor's letter first arrived, and for a moment he found himself unable to speak, caught somewhere between relief and an emotion he did not immediately recognize. "That is entirely reasonable," he said finally. "I will have Mr. Whitfield draw up the settlement this week. Your father and brothers will want for nothing, whatever comes of our marriage." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and then, after a pause, added, "I will also ask that you not present this marriage to society as a love match, Your Grace. I have no wish to be pitied later when the truth inevitably becomes known, nor do I wish to be accused of deceiving anyone. Let it be known plainly as a practical arrangement, entered into with clear eyes on both sides. I would rather bear whatever gossip follows honestly stated facts than the humiliation of a discovered lie." Julian considered this request and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he admired it. Most women in her position, he suspected, would have wanted the opposite, would have wanted the marriage dressed up in whatever romantic language society expected, if only to spare themselves the whispers that always followed a match understood to be one of convenience. Eleanor Hartley, it seemed, cared far more for honesty than for appearances, a quality he was beginning to suspect ran through everything she did. "As you wish," he said, "though I suspect, Miss Hartley, that society will find its own explanations, regardless of what either of us says. People rarely let plain facts interfere with a good story." "Let them talk then," Eleanor said, with the faintest trace of amusement in her voice. "I have never much cared for the good opinion of people who have never troubled themselves to know me properly." They spoke for a while longer in the garden, working out the practical details of what would come next, the timing of the wedding, the arrangements for her father and brothers, the manner in which the marriage would be announced. Julian found, as the conversation continued, that he was in no hurry to end it, that he had begun looking forward to these exchanges with Eleanor in a way he had not anticipated when he first devised his plan for a sensible, unremarkable marriage. When at last he rose to take his leave, Eleanor walked with him as far as the garden gate, and there was a moment, brief but noticeable, where neither of them quite knew how to conclude the visit. It was not the natural ending of a business transaction, though that was what they had both insisted the arrangement should be. It carried, instead, a small warmth that neither of them acknowledged aloud. "I will send word once the settlement is drawn," Julian said. "I will be here," Eleanor replied, and there was something in the way she said it, simple and steady, that stayed with him the entire ride back to Thirlwood Hall, threading through his thoughts, long after the garden gate had disappeared behind him. News of the engagement spread through the parish within days, and then through the wider county within weeks, exactly as Eleanor had predicted. There was gossip, of course, whispered speculation about a duke choosing a plain vicar's daughter over the fashionable young women of the ton. Theories ranging from a hidden scandal to a secret fortune Eleanor's family was rumored to possess, though the family possessed no such thing. Eleanor bore the whispers with the same steady composure she brought to everything else, refusing to let them alter her manner or her plans, and Julian, for his part, found himself surprisingly indifferent to what was said about him, so long as Eleanor herself remained undisturbed by it. Charlotte, when she learned the news, arrived at Thirlwood Hall in a state of barely contained satisfaction, declaring that she had known, from the very first tea, that Miss Hartley was exactly the woman her brother needed, though she stopped short of claiming she had foreseen the particular warmth that seemed to be growing quietly between them. "You look happier than a man entering a marriage of convenience has any right to look," she observed, watching Julian across the dinner table one evening, as the wedding preparations moved steadily forward. "I am simply relieved the matter is settled," Julian said, though even as he spoke the words, he was not entirely certain he believed them himself. Charlotte only smiled, the same knowing smile she had worn the day she first handed her brother a list of 3 names, and said nothing further, content to let time reveal what her brother was not yet ready to admit. The wedding was set for 6 weeks hence, a modest ceremony by the standards of the ton, but a significant one for the small parish that had watched Eleanor Hartley grow from a solemn, capable child into the woman who now stood on the edge of becoming a duchess. Eleanor spent those 6 weeks dividing her time between the practical preparations for her new life and the quiet, private moments in which she allowed herself to consider what she was truly walking into: a marriage without love, built instead on honesty and mutual need, with a deadline hanging over it that neither of them could fully escape. She did not yet know, as the wedding day approached, how much the quiet honesty between them would come to matter in the difficult months ahead, nor how thoroughly the practical arrangement she had agreed to would come to surprise her. She knew only that she had chosen, with clear eyes and full knowledge, and that whatever came next, she would meet it the same way she met everything else, with steady hands and an unflinching willingness to see things as they truly were. The morning of the wedding arrived cool and clear, with a pale autumn sun rising over the fields surrounding the small parish church. Eleanor stood before the mirror in her room at the vicarage, dressed in a gown of soft blue rather than the elaborate white confections favored by fashionable brides in the city, and studied her own reflection with the same steady attention she brought to everything. She did not look, she thought, like a woman about to become a duchess. She looked like herself, plain-faced and practical, her dark hair arranged simply, her expression composed rather than radiant. She wondered, briefly, whether she ought to feel more than she did, whether other brides on their wedding mornings experienced some great swelling of emotion that she seemed to be missing. But when she searched herself for panic or regret, she found none, only a steady readiness, the same feeling she associated with beginning any large and necessary task. Her father knocked softly and entered, dressed in his best coat, his expression a careful mixture of pride and the faint melancholy of a man about to give his daughter away. "You look lovely, my dear," he said. "I look sensible," Eleanor corrected, with a small smile, "which I believe is precisely what the occasion calls for." Her father laughed, a warm sound that eased some of the quiet tension in the room, and offered her his arm. At Thirlwood Hall, Julian was undergoing his own version of the same morning, dressed by his valet in careful silence, his mind occupied not with doubt, but with a strange, restless anticipation he had not expected to feel. He had told himself, in the weeks since Eleanor accepted his proposal, that this marriage was a matter of necessity, a practical solution to an impossible deadline, and nothing more. He had repeated this to himself often enough that he had almost believed it. But standing now in his dressing room, watching the morning light move across the floor, he found himself thinking not of the entailment, or the 12 months, or his uncle's cruel condition, but simply of Eleanor, of the steady way she looked at him, of the small, dry humor that surfaced unexpectedly in her conversation, of the honesty she had offered him in the garden when she could easily have offered flattery instead. Charlotte arrived to fuss over his cravat, though it required no fussing, and studied her brother with open curiosity.
"You are nervous,"
she observed. "I am not nervous. I am marrying a sensible woman under sensible terms. There is nothing to be nervous about." "Then why does your hand keep finding your cravat, brother, as though you fear it has come undone?" Julian dropped his hand, irritated to find she was correct, and said nothing further, which Charlotte took as confirmation enough of whatever theory she was quietly forming. The ceremony itself was small and unhurried, attended by the parish and a modest gathering of Julian's own acquaintance, curious to see for themselves the woman their duke had chosen over the more fashionable candidates available to him. Eleanor walked down the short aisle of the parish church with the same steady composure she brought to everything, and when she reached Julian's side and their eyes met, something passed between them that neither had quite anticipated, a recognition that went beyond the practical terms they had agreed to, though neither would have named it as such in that moment. The vows were spoken plainly, without excessive ornament, and when the ceremony concluded, and they were pronounced husband and wife, there was a brief, quiet moment before the small congregation began its applause, a moment in which Julian looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor looked back at him, both of them seeming to silently acknowledge the strangeness of what they had just done, binding their lives together on terms that had begun as pure necessity, and now felt, somehow, like the beginning of something neither of them fully understood. The wedding breakfast that followed was modest by the standards of the ton, but warm in a way that surprised several of Julian's acquaintances, who had expected a colder, more transactional atmosphere given the circumstances of the match. Reverend Hartley gave a short, heartfelt toast to his daughter's happiness, and Charlotte, watching her brother throughout the meal, noted with quiet satisfaction the way his attention kept returning to his new wife, even when the conversation around the table moved elsewhere. That evening, as the guests departed and Thirlwood Hall settled into a quieter rhythm, Julian and Eleanor found themselves alone together for the first time as husband and wife, standing in the great hall of the house that was now, officially, both of theirs. "It is a very large house," Eleanor observed, looking up at the high ceilings and the long portrait gallery that lined the hall, generations of Ashworth ancestors, gazing down from their gilded frames. "You will grow accustomed to it," Julian said, "though I confess, it took me some time myself, when I first inherited the title. It is easy to feel rather small in rooms built for grander purposes than daily living." "I do not intend to feel small in it," Eleanor said, with the same practical determination she brought to everything. "I intend to learn it thoroughly, the same way I learned the parish accounts, until every room and every account book is as familiar to me as my father's kitchen." Julian found himself smiling at this, a genuine smile, rather than the careful, polite expressions he had worn throughout much of the day. "I do not doubt it for a moment." They walked together through the house, Julian pointing out rooms and their histories, Eleanor asking practical questions about the household staff, the running of the kitchens, the state of the estate's finances, questions that revealed a mind already turning toward the responsibilities she had taken on, rather than dwelling on the romance, or lack of it, in the day's events. Julian answered each question thoroughly, finding a quiet pleasure in her genuine interest, so different from the polite disinterest he had expected from a bride entering a marriage of pure necessity. In the days that followed, the two of them settled into the early rhythms of married life with a surprising ease. Eleanor took to the management of the household with the same competence she had once brought to the vicarage, quickly earning the respect of the staff, who had initially wondered how a plain vicar's daughter would manage the running of so grand an estate. Within a fortnight, she had reorganized the household accounts into a system so clear and efficient that even the estate's longtime steward admitted, somewhat grudgingly, that he wished he had thought of it himself. Julian, for his part, found himself seeking her opinion on matters far beyond the household, consulting her on questions of tenant welfare, on decisions regarding the estate's finances, even on small matters of correspondence that he might once have handled entirely alone. He told himself this was simply practical, that a wife with such evident good sense ought to be consulted, but he knew, in the quiet moments when he allowed himself honesty, that it was more than practicality. He had begun, without quite intending it, to value her company for its own sake. Their marriage, though built on the practical terms they had both insisted upon, carried within it small moments of unexpected warmth. There were evenings when they sat together in the library, Julian reading through estate correspondence while Eleanor worked through the household accounts, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained, occasionally broken by a shared observation or a dry comment that drew a genuine laugh from both of them. There were mornings when Julian found himself looking forward to breakfast not for the food, but for the conversation that would accompany it. Eleanor's blunt, unadorned observations about the day ahead, somehow more welcome to him than any flattery he had ever received. Still, beneath the growing ease of their daily life together, the weight of the entailment remained, a quiet pressure neither of them spoke of directly, but both of them carried. The 12 months continued to shrink, and though their marriage had begun well, the true purpose behind its urgency, an heir to secure the estate against Edmund Grayle's waiting ambitions, remained unresolved. Eleanor was aware of this pressure more acutely, perhaps, than Julian realized, for it was her body upon which the terms of the entailment ultimately depended, and she found herself, in quiet moments alone, turning the matter over with the same careful attention she brought to every other responsibility in her new life. She did not resent the pressure exactly, for she had entered the marriage with full knowledge of what was being asked of her. But she found, as the weeks passed, that she wanted to succeed, not merely for the sake of the settlement she had negotiated for her family, nor even for the security of the estate itself, but increasingly for Julian, whose quiet decency had begun to matter to her, in ways she had not anticipated when she agreed to his practical proposal in the vicarage garden. One evening, several weeks into their marriage, Julian found her in the library later than usual, staring at an open book without reading it, her expression distant in a way he had not seen before. "You seem troubled," he said, taking the seat across from her. Eleanor closed the book and met his gaze, considering, as she always did, whether honesty or careful silence was the better course. She chose honesty, as she nearly always did. "I find myself thinking of the entailment more than I expected to," she admitted. "Not because I regret our arrangement, but because I want very much for it to succeed, and I have begun to realize that wanting something so keenly does not make its arrival any more certain." Julian was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. "I have thought of little else myself, since the day the letter arrived, but I want you to know, Eleanor, that whatever comes of the year ahead, I do not regret choosing you. Whatever the outcome with the estate, I consider myself fortunate in the wife I have found." It was the most openly sentimental thing either of them had said to the other since their marriage began, and Eleanor felt the words settle somewhere deep in her chest, warm and unexpected. She had not realized, until that moment, how much she had wanted to hear something of the sort from him. "That is a very unpractical thing to say, Your Grace," she said softly, though there was no sharpness in it. "I find," Julian replied, "that I am becoming a rather less practical man than I once believed myself to be." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the fire crackling low in the grate, the weight of the entailment still present between them, but somehow lighter for having been spoken of honestly, and Eleanor found herself thinking, as she had not allowed herself to think before, that whatever else came of this marriage, she was glad, entirely and without reservation, that she had chosen to accept his proposal in the garden all those weeks ago. By the 3rd month of their marriage, Thirlwood Hall had begun to feel less like a grand and slightly cold monument to generations of Ashworth ancestors, and more like an actual home, warmed by Eleanor's steady presence in every corner of it. She had reorganized the kitchens for greater efficiency, softened the formality of the drawing rooms with small, sensible touches, and won over even the most skeptical of the older servants through sheer competence and fairness rather than any attempt to charm them. Julian watched this transformation with a quiet admiration that grew steadily alongside it. He had married her, expecting a practical partner in a practical arrangement, and he had received exactly that. But he had not anticipated how much genuine pleasure he would take in watching her capable hands reshape his household, nor how much he would come to rely on her steady presence at the end of each day. Their evenings together had become something he looked forward to, with an eagerness he tried, not always successfully, to disguise. They read together in the library, discussed estate matters over dinner, occasionally walked the grounds in the fading afternoon light, Eleanor asking sharp, practical questions about the tenants and the land that revealed a mind constantly working, constantly seeking to understand the responsibilities she had taken on, more thoroughly than mere duty required. It was on one such walk, through the avenue of elms his grandfather had planted, that Julian found himself telling her things he had not planned to share, small memories of his childhood at Thirlwood Hall, his complicated relationship with the uncle whose will had brought them together, the loneliness he had felt in the years before his inheritance, watching his friends marry for love while he remained convinced such a thing was not meant for him. Eleanor listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when he finished, she said, "You speak of love as though it were a luxury reserved for other men, Your Grace. I wonder whether that was ever entirely true, or whether it was simply easier to believe than to risk finding out otherwise." Julian considered this for a long moment, watching the last light catch the tops of the elms. "I do not know," he admitted. "I have spent so long believing it, I am not certain I would recognize the alternative if it stood before me." "Perhaps you already have," Eleanor said quietly, and then, seeming to surprise even herself with the boldness of the statement, added nothing further, letting the words settle between them, as they continued their walk in a silence that felt, for the first time, charged with something neither of them had yet named aloud. That night, lying awake long after the house had gone quiet, Julian turned Eleanor's words over in his mind, examining them with the same careful attention he might have given a difficult passage of estate law. He had entered this marriage convinced that love was not a factor to be considered, that respect and honesty would suffice. that anything more would be an unexpected bonus rather than a genuine goal. But sitting now with the memory of Eleanor's steady gaze, her dry humor, the quiet strength she brought to every corner of his household and his life, he began to suspect that what he felt for her had already grown well beyond respect, into something he had spent years convincing himself he did not want. Eleanor, in her own room down the corridor, was engaged in a similar reckoning. She had entered the marriage with clear eyes, determined not to let herself hope for more than the practical arrangement they had agreed upon, wary of the disappointment that came from wanting things one had no right to expect. But she found, lying awake in the dark, that she could no longer pretend her feelings for Julian were limited to the respect she had promised herself she would settle for. She thought of his kindness toward the tenants, his genuine interest in her opinions, the quiet vulnerability he had shown her that evening beneath the elms, and she admitted to herself, finally, that she had fallen in love with the man she had married, for entirely practical reasons. Neither of them spoke of these private reckonings the following morning, both retreating instead into the comfortable routines that had come to define their days together. Though something subtle had shifted between them, a new awareness present in the way their eyes met across the breakfast table, in the small, lingering touches that had begun to accompany their conversations, a hand resting briefly on an arm, fingers brushing as papers were passed between them. It was during this period, several months into their marriage, that Eleanor first began to suspect she might be carrying a child. She said nothing at first, wary of raising hopes that might yet prove false, and instead observed herself with the same careful attention she brought to everything, noting small changes, consulting quietly with the housekeeper, an older woman who had raised several children of her own, and recognized the signs before Eleanor herself was entirely certain. When the physician confirmed what she had begun to suspect, Eleanor found herself overwhelmed by an emotion she had not fully anticipated. She had entered this marriage prepared to fulfill the practical terms of the entailment, to try, dutifully and without excessive sentiment, to produce the heir the estate required. But sitting now with the confirmation of her condition, she found that her feelings ran far deeper than practicality, that the prospect of the child growing within her filled her with a tenderness she had not expected, tied not merely to the estate's future, but to the family she and Julian were building together. She waited until evening to tell him, choosing the quiet privacy of the library, where so many of their most honest conversations had taken place. Julian looked up from his correspondence as she entered, and something in her expression, a careful, contained excitement she could not entirely disguise, caught his immediate attention. "You look as though you have news," he said, setting aside his papers. "I do," Eleanor said, and found, despite all her usual composure, that her voice caught slightly on the words. "I am with child, Julian." The use of his given name, rather than his title, was itself a small marker of how far their relationship had traveled from its practical beginnings, and Julian rose from his chair immediately, crossing the room to stand before her, searching her face as though to confirm the truth of what she had said. "Are you certain?" "The physician confirmed it this afternoon. I wish to tell you myself, before the household learns of it." Julian took her hands in his, an unfamiliar gentleness in the gesture that surprised them both. "Eleanor, I hardly know what to say. This is," he paused, searching for words adequate to the moment, and found, to his own surprise, that his voice was unsteady. "This is wonderful news, truly wonderful. It secures the estate," Eleanor said, though even as she said it, she knew the words did not capture the full weight of what she felt. "It does," Julian agreed, "but that is not why I am glad, Eleanor. I find I care a great deal less about the entailment in this moment than I do about you, and about the child we will bring into this world together." Eleanor looked up at him, searching his face for any sign that he spoke merely to comfort her, and found instead a sincerity that matched her own feelings so closely that she felt, for the first time since their wedding day, entirely unguarded in his presence. "I have come to care for you a great deal, Julian," she said softly. "Far more than the terms of our arrangement ever asked of me." "As have I, for you," Julian replied, and in the quiet warmth of the library, with the fire burning low and the news of their child settling gently between them, they allowed themselves, finally, to acknowledge what had grown steadily beneath the practical surface of their marriage, since the very first conversation in the vicarage garden. The following weeks brought a new lightness to Thirlwood Hall, The household staff quietly delighted at the prospect of an heir, Charlotte arriving within days of hearing the news, tearful and triumphant, declaring that she had known, from the very beginning, that her brother's practical arrangement would blossom into something far greater than either of them had planned. Reverend Hartley, informed by careful letter, wrote back with a warmth that brought Eleanor to tears, expressing his joy not merely at the prospect of a grandchild, but at the evident happiness he could read between the careful lines of his daughter's letter. For a brief, golden period, it seemed as though the difficult beginnings of their marriage had given way entirely to contentment. The entailment's harsh deadline transformed from a source of dread into a happy inevitability. The 12 months that had once felt like a cruel countdown, now feeling instead like the natural unfolding of a family coming into being. Julian found himself, in these weeks, more at peace than he had been at any point since his uncle's death, watching Eleanor move through the halls of Thirlwood with a new, quiet radiance, and allowing himself, finally, to believe that his practical solution to an impossible problem had somehow become the truest happiness he had ever known. But even as they settled into this new contentment, unaware of the trouble beginning to stir at the edges of their happiness, Edmund Grail, the cousin who stood to inherit everything should the entailment fail, had begun to take a very close and very unwelcome interest in the news reaching him from Thirlwood Hall. Edmund Grail received the news of the Duchess's condition with an expression that, had anyone been present to observe it, would have revealed a great deal more than the polite disappointment he expressed aloud to the few acquaintances who mentioned it in his hearing. He had spent the months since his cousin's marriage quietly nursing the hope that the entailment's harsh deadline would work in his favor, that a marriage built so plainly on necessity rather than affection would falter under its own practical weight, that no child would arrive in time, or perhaps no child would arrive at all, leaving the estate to fall, as he had long believed it should, into his own more capable hands. The news that Eleanor Hartley, of all women, plain and unremarkable by the standards Edmund valued most highly, had succeeded where a more fashionable bride might have failed, struck him as a particular injustice, one he was not inclined to accept without at least some attempt at resistance. He was not, by nature, a violent man, nor one given to overt scheming of the sort found in cheap novels. His methods, when he chose to employ them, were quieter and more insidious, built on whispered doubt and careful manipulation of appearances, rather than any direct confrontation. He began, in the weeks following the announcement of the Duchess's pregnancy, to cultivate a quiet campaign of doubt among the circles of society most likely to matter, suggesting delicately, over cards and at dinner parties, that a marriage conducted with such unusual haste and such an unusual choice of bride seemed, to his mind, rather too convenient in its timing, rather too neatly arranged to satisfy the exact terms of a will that had, after all, been drawn up by a man now safely beyond the reach of questioning. The whispers took time to travel, as such things always did, but travel they eventually did, reaching Thirlwood Hall in the careful, roundabout manner that gossip always employed, arriving first as vague rumors relayed by well-meaning acquaintances, then growing more specific and more pointed as the weeks progressed. Charlotte was the one who first brought the matter to her brother's attention directly, arriving at Thirlwood Hall with an expression of barely controlled anger that Julian had rarely seen on his sister's face. "Edmund Grail has been spreading the most vile suggestions about your marriage," she said, without preamble, as soon as they were alone in the study. "He has been suggesting, quite carefully, and without ever quite saying so outright, that your marriage was arranged with suspicious haste, and worse, that the timing of Eleanor's condition is rather too convenient to be entirely trusted." Julian felt a cold anger settle in his chest, sharper and more immediate than anything he had felt even when the original entailment letter arrived. "What exactly is he suggesting, Charlotte? Speak plainly." Charlotte hesitated, clearly reluctant to voice the full extent of the rumor, but she had never been one to spare her brother difficult truths. "He is suggesting that the child may not be yours, Julian. That Eleanor may have entered the marriage already carrying another man's child, in order to secure the estate before the deadline could pass unmet." The accusation was so far removed from the truth, so viciously calculated, that Julian's first instinct was disbelief that anyone could credit such a thing, followed swiftly by a fury he had to work to contain. "That is a lie, and a cruel one. Eleanor has been entirely faithful, entirely honest, from the very first day I met her." "I know that, Julian, and so does anyone who has spent even a moment in her company, But you know as well as I do how quickly a well-placed rumor can spread among people who have never met her at all, people who care far more for scandal than for truth. The rumor, once it began circulating in earnest, proved exactly as damaging as Charlotte had feared. Invitations that had once arrived regularly from the wider circle of Julian's acquaintance began to slow, then nearly stopped altogether. Eleanor noticed the shift in how she was received during her rare visits to the nearby town. The careful, appraising looks from women who had once greeted her with polite warmth, the whispered conversations that fell suddenly silent when she entered a room. She said nothing of this to Julian at first, unwilling to add to the burden he already carried, but he noticed the change in her nonetheless. The way she had grown quieter over dinner, the careful, guarded quality that had crept into her usual directness. "You are troubled," he said one evening, echoing the words he had spoken to her months earlier in the library, before the news of her pregnancy had transformed their marriage into something neither of them had expected. Eleanor set down her fork, considering, as always, whether to speak plainly or protect him from a truth she found humiliating. As always, she chose honesty. "I have heard the rumors, Julian, about the child, about the timing of our marriage. I do not know how widely they have spread, but I know they have reached far enough to change how I am received when I venture beyond these walls." Julian's jaw tightened. "You should not have to bear this. I will speak to Grail myself, and if he will not retract his lies, I will pursue whatever legal remedy is available to me." "A legal battle would only give the rumors more life, not less," Eleanor said, with the same practical clarity she brought to every difficulty. "It would confirm, in the minds of those inclined to believe the worst, that there was something worth fighting over in the first place. I think, Julian, that the wiser course is patience. The truth will become evident soon enough, when our child arrives within the natural span of our marriage, and no amount of Edmund Grail's whispering will be able to argue against simple arithmetic." Julian admired her composure even as he raged privately at the injustice of what she was being asked to endure. You should not have to defend yourself against lies simply because Edmund Grail cannot bear to see his ambitions disappointed. "I do not intend to defend myself," Eleanor said. "I intend to continue exactly as I have been, running this household, caring for our child, and refusing to give Edmund Grail the satisfaction of seeing me troubled by gossip I know to be false. Let him whisper. I know the truth, and so do you, and in time, everyone else will know it too." Her resolve steadied him, as it so often did, but the strain of the rumors did not disappear so easily as her calm words suggested it might. Eleanor found herself, in the weeks that followed, increasingly withdrawn from the wider social circles of the county, preferring the quiet company of the household, and the occasional visit from Charlotte, whose fierce loyalty never wavered, to the uncertain reception she risked elsewhere. The pregnancy itself, meanwhile, progressed with its own particular difficulties, a period of illness that left Eleanor pale and weakened for several anxious weeks, during which Julian barely left her side, his fear for her health entirely eclipsing whatever concern he still held for the entailment and its approaching deadline. It was during this period of illness that Edmund Grail, perhaps sensing an opportunity in Eleanor's evident weakness, made a more direct move, arriving unannounced at Thirlwood Hall under the pretense of offering his cousin's sympathy, during what he called, with careful false concern, these trying circumstances. Julian received him in the study with barely concealed hostility, aware that Edmund's visit was unlikely to be motivated by genuine family feeling. "I have heard the Duchess is unwell," Edmund said, settling into a chair he had not been offered. "I trust the child is not in danger." "The Duchess and the child are both well cared for," Julian said coldly. "I am curious, Edmund, what exactly has brought you to Thirlwood Hall in person, rather than continuing to spread your suggestions from the comfort of your usual dinner parties?" Edmund's expression flickered, briefly, with something like discomfort, before settling back into its careful mask of polite concern. "I do not know what you mean, cousin. I have only expressed, to those who ask, a natural curiosity about the rather sudden circumstances of your marriage. You have spread lies about my wife's character in an attempt to discredit our child's legitimacy, in the hope that the entailment might yet fall to you," Julian said bluntly. "I will not pretend otherwise, and I would advise you not to pretend otherwise either. Whatever hopes you harbor for this estate, Edmund, they end the moment my child is born, and no amount of gossip will change the simple facts of timing that will make the truth undeniable to to anyone capable of counting months on their fingers. Edmund rose, his careful pretense finally slipping to reveal something colder and more calculating beneath it. "We shall see, cousin, what the coming months reveal. I wish the Duchess a swift recovery, of course. It would be a shame for anything to go wrong at such a delicate time." The thinly veiled implication in his final words sent a chill through Julian that lingered long after Edmund had departed, and though he told himself the man had no actual power to influence events beyond the reach of gossip, he found himself, in the weeks that followed, watching over Eleanor with a vigilance bordering on fear, aware that whatever remained of the entailment's terrible countdown, they would need to face it together, and carefully, if they hoped to see their child born safely into a future free of Edmund Grayle's grasping ambitions. Eleanor's illness lingered longer than the physician had first predicted, a stubborn weakness that kept her confined to her rooms through much of the 7th month of her pregnancy, and Julian found himself, during those difficult weeks, confronting a fear unlike anything the entailment itself had ever caused him. The estate, the title, Edmund Grayle's grasping ambitions, all of it had once seemed like the great crisis of his life, the problem that consumed his every waking thought. Now, watching Eleanor grow pale and tired against her pillows, he realized how little any of it mattered to him, compared to her simple well-being. He spent his evenings at her bedside, reading to her when she had the strength to listen, sitting quietly beside her when she did not, and in those long, uncertain hours, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, from a cold and desperate ledger of practical requirements, to a devotion that had crept up on him so gradually, he had barely noticed its arrival, until it had become the whole of his heart. "You are hovering," Eleanor told him one evening, her voice weak, but carrying a trace of her familiar dry humor. "I am not so fragile as you seem to believe, Julian." "I have every right to hover," he said, taking her hand. "I nearly lost you to worry these past weeks, and I find I am not a man who manages fear gracefully." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "I did not expect, when I agreed to your practical proposal in the garden, that I would ever hear a Duke of Thirlwood admit to managing anything ungracefully. I did not expect a great many things about this marriage," Julian admitted. "Least of all how completely you would come to matter to me." It was during one of these quiet evenings that a letter arrived from Mr. Whitfield, the family solicitor, containing news that briefly reignited the anxiety Julian had been trying to hold at bay. Edmund Grayle, it seemed, had engaged his own solicitor to formally question the timing of the marriage and the legitimacy of the coming child, requesting a review of the parish records and the marriage registry in an attempt to build some formal case, however flimsy, that might delay or complicate the entailment's resolution. Julian brought the letter to Eleanor, once she had regained enough strength to discuss such matters without undue strain, and watched her read it with the same steady composure she brought to everything, though he could see, beneath the calm surface, a flicker of genuine anger. "He truly means to pursue this," Eleanor said, setting down the letter. "Even now, with the child so close to arriving." "Whitfield assures me the case has no legal merit," Julian said. "The parish records will show plainly enough when our marriage was recorded, and any competent physician can attest to the natural progression of your condition, matching the timeline exactly. But Edmund does not need to win such a case to cause us difficulty. He need only delay matters, create enough doubt and disruption to make the final months before the deadline as painful as possible." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her hand resting protectively over the swell of her belly. "Then we must ensure he fails entirely, Julian. Not merely in the courts, but in the eyes of everyone who might still listen to his lies. How do you propose we do that?" "By refusing to hide," Eleanor said, with sudden decisiveness. "I have spent these past months keeping to the house, avoiding society, allowing his whispers to go unanswered, because I believed silence was the wiser course. Perhaps it was, while I remained unwell, but I am recovering now, and I think it is time we face this directly, rather than waiting for the truth to reveal itself on its own schedule." Over the following weeks, as Eleanor's strength gradually returned, she and Julian began appearing together at the small gatherings and social occasions they had largely avoided since the rumors first began, Eleanor moving through these events with a calm, unshakable dignity that gradually began to shift the tide of opinion in their favor. She answered pointed questions about her condition with the same blunt honesty that had first drawn Julian to her, refusing to be embarrassed or evasive, meeting curious stares with a steady confidence that left little room for continued speculation. Charlotte, meanwhile, waged her own quiet campaign among the women of her acquaintance, countering Edmund's whispers with careful, factual accounts of the marriage's timeline, of Eleanor's evident devotion to her husband, of the genuine warmth that anyone who spent even a short time in the couple's company could plainly observe. Slowly, gradually, the tide of gossip began to turn, the vague suspicions Edmund had cultivated giving way, in the face of Eleanor's calm dignity and the plain arithmetic of dates, to a growing sympathy for the Duchess and a corresponding contempt for the cousin who had tried so transparently to discredit her. Edmund's legal inquiry, when it finally proceeded, collapsed almost immediately under the weight of its own thin evidence. The parish registry confirmed the marriage date beyond any dispute. The physician who had attended Eleanor throughout her pregnancy provided a clear and professional account of the timeline, and even the solicitor Edmund had engaged appeared, by the account later relayed to Julian, visibly embarrassed by the flimsiness of the case he had been asked to build. But it was not the collapse of the legal challenge that finally ended Edmund Grayle's campaign against them. It was, instead, a single evening, at a gathering hosted by a prominent family in the county, where Edmund, perhaps emboldened by wine, or simply by his own mounting desperation, made the mistake of repeating his insinuations directly in Eleanor's presence, apparently unaware, or uncaring, that she stood close enough to hear every word. Eleanor turned to face him, the room falling gradually silent as other guests noticed the confrontation building, and spoke with a calm clarity that carried easily across the quieted room. "Mr. Grayle," she said, "I have heard, through various channels, the suggestions you have been so industrious in spreading about my character and my child's legitimacy. I have chosen, until now, to let the plain facts speak for themselves, trusting that reasonable people would recognize a lie when it was offered to them without evidence. But since you have chosen to repeat your accusations directly in my hearing, I think it only fair that I respond directly as well." She continued, laying out the timeline of her marriage and pregnancy, with the same precise, unemotional clarity she brought to a household ledger, inviting anyone present who doubted her account to consult the parish registry themselves, and concluding with a final observation, delivered in a tone so calm, it carried more weight than any outraged accusation could have managed. "I understand, Mr. Grayle, that you stand to lose a great deal, should my child be born healthy and legitimate, as they will be. I understand that disappointment can drive a man to unfortunate behavior. But I would ask you to consider, before you continue spreading falsehoods about a woman and a child who have done nothing to wrong you, whether the estate you covet is truly worth the reputation you are so thoroughly destroying in your pursuit of it." The room remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking, and Edmund Grayle, finding no ready response to match the calm devastation of her words, made his excuses and departed the gathering shortly afterward. His campaign of doubt effectively ended by the very directness he had underestimated in the woman he had tried to discredit. Julian, watching his wife across the room, felt a surge of pride so fierce it nearly overwhelmed him. He crossed to her side once the gathering's attention had shifted elsewhere, taking her hand and speaking quietly enough that only she could hear. "You did not need my help at all, it seems." "I have never needed rescuing, Julian," Eleanor said, though her voice carried a warmth beneath its usual bluntness. "I have only ever needed someone willing to stand beside me while I handled matters myself. And that, I think, you have done very well." They returned to Thirlwood Hall that evening with the sense that a genuine turning point had passed. The shadow Edmund Grayle had cast over their marriage finally beginning to lift, the last difficult weeks before the deadline stretching ahead of them now with something closer to hope than dread. The entailment's terrible countdown had not disappeared, but it had, at last, lost its power to frighten them, replaced instead by the simple, steady anticipation of the child who would soon arrive to settle the matter entirely, born not into a marriage of cold necessity, but into one that had, against every expectation, either of them had carried into the vicarage garden all those months before, become a true and lasting partnership. The final weeks before the deadline passed in a strange, suspended calm, the household at Thirlwood Hall settling into a quiet rhythm of anticipation as Eleanor's time drew near. The rumors Edmund Grayle had spread lay largely forgotten now, dismissed by most of the county as the bitter grumbling of a disappointed man, and the visits that had once slowed to a trickle resumed their earlier warmth, neighbors and acquaintances arriving with small gifts and well wishes for the coming child. Julian found himself, during these final weeks, unable to concentrate fully on the estate business that had once consumed his every waking hour. He caught himself standing at windows, watching for Eleanor's return from short walks in the garden, found his correspondence interrupted by sudden worry over whether she had eaten enough, slept enough, rested enough. Eleanor, for her part, bore his anxious attention with the same patient good humor she brought to everything, occasionally teasing him gently for his hovering, though she never asked him to stop. "You will wear a path in the floorboards, pacing as you do," she told him one evening, watching him cross the drawing room for perhaps the 10th time in as many minutes. "I find I cannot help it," Julian admitted. "I have never before had so much riding on a single event, and I do not mean the estate, Eleanor. I mean you. I mean our child. I find the entailment has become the smallest part of what concerns me now." Eleanor reached for his hand, drawing him to sit beside her. "I know," she said softly. "I feel it too. This began as an arrangement to satisfy your uncle's will, and I do not think either of us imagined, in that garden all those months ago, that it would become the truest happiness either of us had known." "I did not deserve such fortune," Julian said. "I came to you with nothing but a practical proposal and a desperate deadline, and you gave me far more than the arrangement ever asked of you. You gave me the same, Julian. Do not forget that. I came to this marriage as plainly and practically as you did, and I have found in it a partnership I never dared to hope for, in a life that once seemed destined for quiet, unremarkable service to a small parish." The child arrived on a cold morning in late winter, nearly 11 months after the solicitor's letter had first arrived with its brutal ultimatum. The birth attended by a physician, Julian had insisted travel from the city, despite the considerable expense, unwilling to leave anything to chance after the difficulties of Eleanor's pregnancy. The labor was long and difficult, and Julian spent the hours pacing the corridor outside Eleanor's rooms with a fear more consuming than anything the entailment had ever caused him, praying, in the quiet, desperate way of a man who had rarely had cause to pray before, for his wife's safety above all else. When the physician finally emerged, exhausted but smiling, to inform him that both mother and child had come through safely, a healthy son with his mother's steady dark eyes, Julian felt a relief so overwhelming that his knees very nearly gave way beneath him. He was permitted to see them shortly afterward, and found Eleanor propped against her pillows, tired but radiant, the infant cradled carefully in her arms. She looked up as he entered, and the smile she offered him carried none of her usual careful composure, only pure, unguarded joy. "Julian," she said softly. "Come meet your son." He crossed the room and sat carefully beside her, looking down at the small, sleeping face of the child who had, in the strangest and most unexpected way, brought them together, and now completed the family neither of them had dared to imagine when their arrangement first began. "He is perfect," Julian said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "Thank you, Eleanor, for all of it, for agreeing to marry a stranger with nothing to offer but honesty and necessity, for giving me a family I never believed I would have." "Thank you for choosing plainness and sense over beauty and flattery," Eleanor replied, "and for discovering, along the way, that plainness and sense could grow into something far greater than either of us expected." News of the child's safe arrival, well within the terms of the entailment's 12-month deadline, spread quickly through the county, and Mr. Whitfield arrived within days to formally confirm that the terms of the late Duke's will had been satisfied in full, the estate and title secured permanently in Julian's line, Edmund Grayle's ambitions finally and completely extinguished by the simple, undeniable fact of a healthy child born to a marriage that had, whatever its unusual beginnings, proven itself entirely genuine. Edmund himself sent a brief, cold letter of formal congratulations, the last communication either Julian or Eleanor would receive from him for many years, his campaign of doubt having cost him whatever remaining goodwill he might once have enjoyed among their mutual acquaintances. Julian read the letter once, felt no particular satisfaction in his cousin's defeat, and set it aside, far more interested in the small, warm weight of his son sleeping in the nursery down the hall than in any lingering thoughts of the man who had tried so hard to take it all away. Charlotte arrived within the week, tearful and delighted, declaring the child the finest infant she had ever seen. A claim she made, Julian noted with amusement, about every infant she encountered, though he privately agreed with her assessment in this particular case. Reverend Hartley traveled to Thirlwood Hall as soon as his health permitted, holding his grandson with trembling hands and an expression of such pure joy that Eleanor found herself in tears at the sight of it. In the months that followed, as their son grew from a sleeping infant into a curious, watchful child, with his mother's steady gaze and his father's quiet humor, Julian and Eleanor settled fully into the life they had built together, a marriage that had begun as the coldest of practical arrangements and had grown, through honesty and patience, and a willingness to see each other clearly rather than through the distorting lens of romantic expectation, into a partnership neither of them would have traded for any of the grander, more fashionable matches Julian might once have pursued. Eleanor continued to manage the estate's affairs, with the same competence she had brought to the vicarage, earning, over time, a genuine respect throughout the county that had nothing to do with her rank and everything to do with her evident capability and honesty. Julian, for his part, found himself a better landlord, a better duke, and a far happier man than he had ever expected to become, guided always by the steady, unflinching sense of the woman he had chosen for the plainest and most practical of reasons, and come to love, for reasons that had nothing to do with practicality at all. On the evening of their first wedding anniversary, they walked together once more beneath the avenue of elms where Julian had first confessed the depth of his growing feelings for her, their son asleep in the nursery under the watchful eye of his nurse, the entailment and its terrible countdown, now nothing more than a distant memory, transformed by time into the strange and fortunate origin of the life they now shared. "Do you remember," Eleanor said, "how certain you were, that first day in my father's garden, that you wanted nothing more from marriage than sense and practicality?" "I remember," Julian said, "and I have never been more grateful to have been so thoroughly wrong about what I truly needed." Eleanor laughed, a warm, easy sound that had become as familiar to him now as his own heartbeat, and slipped her hand into his as they continued their walk beneath the darkening sky, two people who had come together through necessity and found, against every expectation, the truest partnership either of them had ever known. In the years that followed, the story of the Duke of Thirlwood and his plain, sensible bride became something of a quiet legend throughout the county, told not as a tale of desperate necessity or cold calculation, but as a gentle reminder that the truest happiness often arrives not through grand romantic gestures, but through honesty, patience, and the simple willingness to see another person clearly, for exactly who they are. Their son grew into a thoughtful young man who carried forward the values both his parents had shown him, and in time, siblings joined him in the nursery at Thirlwood Hall, a family built not on the fragile foundation of fleeting passion, but on the far sturdier ground of mutual respect, shared honesty, and a love that had grown slowly, steadily, and completely, exactly as Eleanor Hartley had always approached everything of true importance in her life. And though the entailment that had once threatened everything was, in time, forgotten by all but the family historians who noted it as a curious footnote in the Ashworth family records, Julian and Eleanor never forgot the strange and fortunate chain of events that had brought them together, nor did they ever stop being grateful for the 12 months that had once felt like a cruel sentence, and had become, instead, the beginning of the happiest chapter either of them had ever known.